I'm Kerry from Living in Loveliness, and today I'm going to show you how to make this beautiful book cover with your little pocket on the front for your pen, how to insert that ribbon from issue 6 of your fabulously fast Fat Quarter Fun Love to Be Organised. For this project you're going to need a few things, including your pins, a sharp pair of scissors to cut your fabric, always your stitch unpicker just in case we encounter any hiccups. You'll need a small pair of scissors for trimming the corners when we come to reverse the project at a later stage, just to get those beautiful corners on there. You'll need your pre-cut fabrics, a small piece of batting just for the inside to line this project. You'll need a little 505. This is completely optional, but whenever I'm working with batting, I do like to spray the batting to secure the fabrics, especially because we're going to sew a satin stitch around these lovely little hexes in a little while. You'll need your book to pop into your book cover. This is an A6 book. There's about 300 pages in here. If you're inserting the ribbon, now this instruction is not in your step-by-step, so if you are inserting the ribbon, you'll need a piece of ribbon 12 inches long, and I'm going to show you how to add that. You'll need your pressing cloth, and also, just because we're going to use that 505 spray, just a scrap piece of paper, scrap piece of fabric to catch any of the glue on there, so this does not transfer onto your ironing board or your cutting mat. So the first thing to do, like every project, is to cut all of those pieces out and to lay them in the order that you're happy with. So I've already gone ahead and done that right through the front of the fabric. And then for the hexes, because there were such beautiful flowers in the Liberty fabrics this month, I've decided that I'm going to cut my hexes from the same panel of fabric. So I did cut mine from this in your September issue, and I've decided I'm going to showcase those 3 beautiful flowers there. You can of course cut these from any remnants, but it is quite nice to have those on the front with a little fussy cutting. So first of all, what we're going to do is to create the binding for our pen pocket. So I'll just turn this around so I can see all of my fabrics in front of me. And then you've got that little piece there, which is your F piece. What we're going to do is to just have the wrong side of the fabric facing up towards you and just give that a little press. It is a slither, it's 1.5 inches, so it is a really small piece of fabric, but as you can see on the other project, it really does make that little pocket there just pop, so you can see those lovely fabrics. I have on this one from the Liberty option used the 2 mustard, and again just brought the blue from the back onto the front to really show where that pocket goes. The next thing to do is to take your pocket panel, which is your D piece, and make sure, especially if you have a pattern direction, that this is the right way up. We're going to place that on top of the D piece, aligning those raw edges, and just slide 2 pins through and sew across that raw edge. Just using your straight stitch, just using that 1/4 inch seam allowance for this particular step in the pattern. So just resting this onto the machine, using that straight stitch. No need to reverse at the start and finish points, because this will tuck into our seams in just a moment. So removing those pins, remember you can leave your pins in providing you leave those a good finger space back. The next thing we're going to do is to place that panel pattern facing up towards us on the ironing board. Push against that binding to get a lovely finish. And as we fold this over, you've then got the raw edge pointing up towards that folded edge. As we fold the folded edge over, we want to make that folded edge rest just below that stitch line. By doing that, it just means when we sew through this in just a moment, we know that we're going to catch that fabric on both sides, but equally distributing that beautiful burgundy fabric on both the front and the back of our project. I'm going to return that to the sewing machine and change my stitch to a zigzag, removing those pins because we don't want to sew across. I'm resting this panel onto the machine, so when I'm looking at my sewing machine foot, that is running through the bottom of the binding. So when I'm doing that little zigzag there, I'm distributing that zigzag equally over both sides of the fabric. Take a moment to trim away those extra threads. And then what we're going to do next is to just place the panels in front of us, A, B, and then pop your panel on top. And then your middle section, and then that E section just there. So we've got A, B, C with your binding, D and E. And what we're going to do is to sew these together to make sure that binding is sewn into place. Let's just have a little look and adjust that. I've got those in that wrong order there. So take a moment to make sure your fabrics are in the right order. What we're going to do is to just bring the two panels across and line those up, making sure all those raw edges marry up, especially for that pocket, so we know we've caught that binding. And again, if you've got a pattern direction, make sure your pattern's the correct way, because I want to make sure I catch that binding. I'm pinning through the fabric, securing that binding into position. And 3 pins for this section is just enough. Sitting that back onto the machine, returning our stitch back to a straight stitch, and we're just sewing along that raw edge, and trimming away those threads from the start and stop point. By leaving the pins, we haven't got to worry about removing those, but as we open this up now, we know we've got that binding secure. What we don't want to happen to the binding at this stage is that there's any twists and turns on there, or that it's sitting at an angle. So just keep that flat onto the table, just check your bindings in the correct position. Then we're going to bring the B piece on top, aligning that raw edge and sliding the pins through all layers. Again, just feeling for the binding, pushing your pin through the binding to secure that into place to stop any movement. And again, we're going to sew along that raw edge just there. And sewing along using that 1/4 inch seam allowance. And we know now that that binding is secure and we've got that little pen pocket in place for the front of our diary. We will go ahead in just a while and press that, but just returning this back to your pressing mat and bringing that A piece across, 2 fabrics pattern facing, aligning all those raw edges, making sure they marry up at both the top and the bottom, and sliding your pins through the fabric, always checking that pattern direction if you have one. Resting this back onto the machine and sewing along that raw edge using that 1/4 inch seam allowance. And again, just taking the bottom and the top fabric away. Now we've got that front panel made. What we're going to do is to just turn this over and just press those seams flat. We want those nice and flat. Allow the seams to go in the direction they want to, or if you're using a dark fabric for any of your panels, always press those seams to the darkest side. We're going to turn this over and just give it another little press on the top to avoid any pleats in the fabric at this stage. So we've now got that front panel for the front of our book. Just keep those little hexes to one side and bringing that piece of scrap paper onto the panel, onto the ironing board or onto your workstation, popping your batting flat. Seem to have picked up a little bit of cotton here, so we'll just remove those, and just lightly spraying that batting. We only want a little bit on there, and that really is to secure the fabrics into place. And we're going to rest those fabrics nicely on top. So we've now got that panel. The next thing we're going to do is to pop these hexes in place. Now you can use a plique paper if you want to, but because they're so small, again, I'm just going to pop a little bit of 505 onto the back of each of those hexes there and position those onto the fabric. Now what's really important is that you put that first hexie in line, and you can position these wherever you want to on here, but you're making sure that first hexie is in line with that seam. and then resting your next 2 hexes, butting those raw edges up against each other. Sitting this on top, so we've got those lovely hexes just resting here. We're going to sit this onto the machine and set our machine to a satin stitch. I've used a nice blue to really make these hexes pop on the front. You can use any colour you want to, but it is quite nice to have those fabrics pop. So for myself, I'm going to select a zigzag stitch and reduce the stitch to get that lovely close zigzag or satin stitch there. Resting this onto the machine, making sure the foot is resting on top of the first hexie. Let's just rethread that machine there, we've lost the thread. That's it. So you can have a little play with your machine. So you know what my machine is on. My width is 0.5. Sorry, my zigzag width is 2 and my stitch length is 0.5. So it keeps it nice and close. And each time I get to the corner on the hexie, I'm just inserting the needle into the fabric and readjusting that stitch there. And we're simply going to allow the machine to sew around all raw edges of our hexie now. Each time pivoting your fabric, making sure those 2 hexes or those sets of hexes there are butted up against each other. So when you do that joining stitch length, you're sewing across both raw edges. And turning every time I get to that raw edge. I'm just going to stop a moment and remove that thread on the top because I don't want that getting caught up in the project. And again, just sewing across. And then we've got that beautiful first hexie. I just take this off the machine just so you can see that it's really giving that beautiful colour to really highlight that flower. You could, if you wanted to, change your top thread. Make sure it's the same quality thread that you're working with, but perhaps you want to change your top thread so each of those hexes are a different colour. And again, we'll just rethread the machine. I think I've cut the thread off just a little too soon. There we go. So we'll do that second hexie now. Each time I get to the point of the hexie, just resting the needle in. Take a moment to remove that thread here just on the side. And then when we come to that joining hexie there, just making sure the 2 raw edges are neatly together. And then you're sewing across both pieces then. There we go. So we're on that second hexie. We'll just slow down to the bottom. And just removing that thread from the machine, top and bottom, trimming away those joining threads, and then that will bring us onto our third hexie just there. So we've got those lovely 2 hexes now highlighted with that lovely blue thread, and we're starting again at the bottom. And again, we've cut the thread too short, so let's thread for the 3rd time. I think we might actually be on the 10th time. But let's rethread that machine. Make sure we leave a good tail on that thread so it doesn't keep popping out. sew into the bottom point. And because I don't want to sew across that seam, I'm just going to make sure that I move my stitch across slightly. So I'm just sewing into the seam, if you like, but I'm not sewing across the seam. And I'll show you that in just a moment so you can see. Just taking away that extra joining thread there so it's not getting caught up. So again, just taking that thread out, trimming those threads on the back so it's nice and tidy on the back as well. We want it to look as neat, although you won't see the back because of course that will be on the sleeve of your book cover. But so you've got it nice and tight on the back and you've got those lovely seams. And when I've sewn, I've just slightly overcrossed those on the seam. The next thing that we're going to do is to rest this onto the sewing machine, and we're going to sew using a zigzag or decorative stitch along each of those seams. This is optional. The difference when I'm working on the front is I'm going to sew a zigzag just to this line. I don't want that zigzag showcased on my hexes, so I'll knot off the thread or reverse stitch, start again just this side, again reverse stitching and sewing to the bottom there. So we're going to do that on all, how many have we got? 1, 2, 3, all 3 seams just there. So we'll just set up the machine again, rest that onto the machine and select your zigzag stitch on your normal zigzag stitch length. I always have quite a wide zigzag, really so I can see that lovely zigzag showcased on the front just here. So allowing the machine foot to rest on that seam and sewing along the full length. Remember, for the hexie section, we'll stop just as we approach, knot off that thread, raise your presser foot, tease it a little further so you're skipping across that hexie if you like, doing your knotting or reverse stitch. At this point we don't want that stitch to come open, and now sewing along the rest of that seam. When we get to the bottom, we're going to raise the presser foot, pivot the fabric, tease out a little thread, and again just sew this time along the full length of that project. The full length of that seam. Once we get to the top, we're going to raise the presser foot, tease a little thread and jump across to that next seam. It's important as well that you make sure that thread is sitting under the presser foot to stop that thread getting tangled up. And we're sewing along that third section now. So we're actually working on the back section at this stage. And by using that blue thread, again, it's really making that fabric pop on here. So we've sewn along each of these seams on both sides of our little pen pocket there. The next thing that we've got to do is to create the inside of the book. So if I just show you mine here, on the inside of your book, we're just going to put this little section here so the book slots into here and secures that into place. So I've actually chosen to use 2 different pieces of the fabric, and what I'm going to do is to fold these across the top and press this fabric in half. So this is for both the inside sleeve pockets, and we're pressing these in half. There we go. And now to give these a nice stitch on there, where that fold is, I'm just going to zigzag along the full length of that fold. So this is our raw edge, we're zigzagging along, or straight stitching, whichever you prefer, along that folded edge. So just resting this onto the machine, using the zigzag stitch which is already on, and just zigzag stitching along the full length and this just gives a nice finish on the inside pocket. I have used 2 different of the fabrics so I can showcase them. You know, I couldn't decide actually, the fabrics are just so beautiful. And although you only see a little glimmer of these when you reach either the front or the back of your book, it's quite nice to expose those lovely fabrics. So once we're at the end, we've actually chain stitched those together. So just cut that joining thread and cut that extra thread on the start and finish point. Now if you want to insert the ribbon, this step is not featured in your pattern booklet. So what we want to do here is to just find your ribbon. The ribbon that I'm using is 12 inches. I'm just going to take a moment and trim away those extra bits of batting now. Mine was just a little bit too big. I was just using a little remnant of batting here. You can of course use your template to cut the correct size. And you'll also have your inside pocket as well just there in a moment. So what we're going to do with the ribbon is to fold. Make sure you know which is the top, so just double check you've got your pocket here. Fold that piece in half and just fold to find that center piece. Once you've got the center piece, just place your ribbon on top and slide a pin through. And all we're going to do is attach a basting stitch on there. So increasing the stitch length. So I'm returning it back to a straight stitch. Actually, I'm not going to increase the length. I want a nice close stitch. So I'm just sewing across the raw edge to secure that ribbon, and I'm actually going to reverse stitch as well. So we're just securing the ribbon, so we haven't got to worry about this in just a moment. So your ribbon is now inserted into the center of your fabric. The next thing to do is to place these on either side. So decide if, like me, you've chosen 2 opposite fabrics. So these are contrasting, and we're placing the raw edge on the raw edge of our book cover, placing that flat on top on both sides. Once we've got that flat, we want to make sure this ribbon is tucked into the center, so we're not sewing this in the wrong place. Place that panel on top, pinning those raw edges. There we go. Making sure if you've got a pattern direction, then those pattern directions are the correct way. This is going to create the inside of your fabric. I have got just a little bit too much fabric here. I'm just going to take that extra fabric off. We want to make sure all those raw edges are marrying up. You can see that ribbon's just poking out at the top. Whenever I'm inserting handles or ribbon into a project, I always overhang it by 1/4 inch. And that really is just to secure that into place. Making sure all the raw edges along the bottom, again, are marrying up. And because you've got quite a lot of fabric here, using that batting, we want to make sure that turning gap is a good 3 inches at the bottom. So just using your fabric pen, we're simply going to mark up a 3 inch turning gap, just as a reminder when we come to sew around this. Because of the amount of layers, I am going to pop in just a couple of extra pins just here. So there's no movement on there. So at this stage, it is incredibly important to make sure all those raw edges are marrying up, both on the bottom and the top. We're going to place this onto the machine, working with a second pen mark. We're going to start with a zigzag stitch, with a reverse stitch. We're going to sew to the corner. When we get to the corner, just stop, insert our needle to secure that in place, raise the presser foot and pivot the fabric. Let's have a little look, we're missing the bobbin. So while I just collect the bobbin from the bottom, and we'll do that step once again. So starting at that second pen mark, making sure your thread is tucked out of the way, starting with that reverse stitch and sewing to that first corner. The reverse stitch there is to secure the fabric when you come to turn this inside out. Drop your needle and pivot and then we're sewing along all 4 raw edges. When we get to the second corner, inserting that needle and pivoting the project again. We're now going to cross that ribbon. We've already secured this into place, so we're just going to sew straight across that ribbon. When we get to the corner, inserting that needle and pivoting again on that 3rd side, keeping that 1/4 inch all the way around until we get to that 4th corner. When we arrive at the 4th corner, we're going to insert the needle, pivot once more, and sew to that 2nd pen mark, finishing with a reverse stitch. And taking a moment just to cut those joining threads and remove any excess thread that we've got attached as well. We seem to have scooped up a lot of thread here, so just take a moment to remove all of those joining threads, even the ones that we've collected on our way around. I can see I've missed just a little bit there, so I'm just going to sew across that panel once more. And removing all of those pins. Now on the corners, because we want a nice snug corner, what we're going to do here is just to use your small scissors or your fabric scissors, and we're going to trim through all layers of both corners about 1 inch, so we get a nice finish on there, and that will give us that beautiful finish on the corner of our book when we come to reverse this. So repeat that on all 4 sides. And pop these to one side for now, and then popping our fingers through, both fingers through that little turning gap into your furthest point, and gently teasing that project through that turning gap to get the front cover of that, well, to get the book cover. And look at those lovely fabrics. So making sure the little pockets are facing towards the inside of the bag, and that's really important at this stage. So reversing these each way, popping your scissors through just into the corner, slowly working on that corner to get that lovely finish. We don't want to push too far because we really don't want to create a hole in any of these corners, but equally we do want a lovely finish on there. And again onto the 3rd corner. Just slowly rolling the corners to get that lovely finish. And we'll just give that just a little press. You've got your little ribbon there. And just really pressing that fabric to really push out all those corners and get a nice finish. Now naturally that raw edge that we've got here will naturally tuck inside to create the nice finish on there, and we just give that a press on both the front and the back. And because of the amount of fabric that we've got in there, we want to make sure that we finish that little gap. So just using a needle and thread, we're simply going to just slip stitch that little gap closed, so we haven't got any raw edges exposed on there. So just threading your needle, doubling up your thread and knotting the end of your cotton here. Let's try that again. So bringing those 2 tails together, popping a knot onto the bottom through both threads, and trimming away those extra little tails there. And just finishing that turning gap with a little slip stitch, so you won't see this stitch, providing you catch the inside of both fabrics. And I find just angling the needle here, that stitch naturally tucks on the inside. So we'll do that along that gap, just to give the the book cover that lovely finish. And when we get to the end, we're just going to go through, leave our little loop, pop the needle through the loop, knot off the thread, and repeat that for a second time to make sure we've absolutely knotted that fabric off. And then to finish the project, because we've got so many layers here, just take a moment to slide a few pins through, just to keep those into position as we're sewing around, especially because we've got the batting in there. We want that nice finish. Keep your ribbon tucked out of your way for now. And to finish this project, we're simply going to sew around all 4 sides, just using a straight stitch. I'm just going to top up the bobbin here. I can see I'm quite low on the bobbin. So while we top up the bobbin, there are a number of things that you can do on the front of here if you wanted to. If you enjoy hand sewing, you could absolutely put some more, you know, some decorative stitches on there. You could pop somebody's name on here if you wanted to. So if you're making this as a personalised gift, you could absolutely pop somebody's name onto the front, or even the year if you're going to make this to cover a diary, which would be wonderful actually, where you can put a personal message on there. There we go. So again, I'm now just using the seam allowance I'm allowing is 1/8 of an inch. I'm on a straight stitch and I'm going to increase my stitch length to the highest, which is a 5. And I'm going to start sewing from this bottom where I put that, where I did that little slip stitch just a moment ago. So just ahead of it, 1/8 of an inch in. We don't need to worry about reverse stitching because we'll go back over that stitch. When you get to the corner, just take a moment, insert your needle, raise your presser foot and pivot around your project. If your machine allows you to reduce the speed and you want that nice straight finish on there, just reduce the speed that you're sewing to get a lovely finish on this project. We're at that second corner. Make sure the ribbon is tucked into your hand, into your right hand if you like, and then you know that you're not getting that caught up in the project. So you can see my ribbon's just flat on the machine. I'm in that third corner and just pivoting. And because this is the side we're going to see, it's definitely worth slowing down your speed and getting that lovely straight stitch finish on here. Into the corner, and where I can see that thread where I started, I'm just going to trim those bits away on both the top and the bottom of the project to prevent that knotting up. And just make sure I sew just across that start point. You can finish with a reverse stitch there if you want to. So just trim those joining threads from your project, take away all of those extra fabrics there, and you have that lovely cover ready to insert into your book to get that beautiful finish. But let's just have a little look on the inside. Not only is your book beautiful on the outside, but you also have those lovely fabrics on the inside, so you can change this book over at your leisure time and time again. So you can use this for your diary, you can use it for your books. I hope you've enjoyed today's tutorial. Simply slide your book into those little covers now, and we're ready to finish with our little book cover here. So let's just slide these in, and you can see just on the inside your book is tucked nicely into that book cover. I hope you've enjoyed today's tutorial. I will tuck the other one into the book in just a moment. You've got your little hanging ribbon there. I look forward to seeing all of your beautiful collections in the Fabulously Fast Fat Quarter Fun group at your leisure. Bye bye for now.